The Anglo-Saxons. Let's lay the basics down. First of all, who were they? The Anglo-Saxons were the people who settled in England after the Romans left. They came from parts of what is now Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. There were roughly 2 million Anglo-Saxons, which, despite being an incredibly large number, is actually very tiny for a population, if you consider that the current population of England is around 55 million. One explanation for this low population could be the low life expectancy and high infant mortality rates. Most of the population farmed land in order to grow the resources they needed to live. So now we have the very basics. What about the structure of Anglo-Saxon society? Almost every society that ever has been or is, has at least some form of hierarchy. Someone at the top, perhaps a king, and a large group of people, right at the very bottom, normally the poor. Anglo-Saxon society is certainly no exception to this. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, making up roughly 10% of the population. They could be bought and sold and were seen as property. However, slaves were punished less harshly for committing crimes, so to not damage their ability to work. Across the water, the Normans thought slave ownership was barbaric, but for Anglo-Saxons, slaves were a normal part of life. Next up in the hierarchy were the peasant farmers, who made up most of the population, as shown by this diagram I've nicked from the textbook. Peasant farmers would rent small farms from a lord, doing a certain amount of work for him, before they were allowed to use the rest of their harvest to support themselves and their family. And if they didn't do the work for the lord, they could risk losing their rights to use the land, which would be a disaster. There was another type of peasant farmer as well, the ceorl. Ceorls were free peasant farmers who were not tied to their land. Like the ordinary peasant farmer, the ceorl would do work on the land for a lord. However, they could go and work for a different lord if they wished to. Moving up the ladder, we find Thegns, local lords. By the year 1060, England had between 4,000 and 5,000 Thegns. In order to become a Thegn, you must meet certain requirements, such as owning more than 5 hides of land. Hides, by the way, was a measurement of land, roughly similar to 120 acres. Anyway, a Thegn must own more than 5 hides of land and live in a manor with a tower and separate church. Thegns formed part of the aristocracy. They were its warrior class. Earls sat at the top of the aristocracy, above Thegns and second from the king. They ruled over vast areas of land called earldoms. They would compete with each other as well, through loyalty, to be the most trusted and relied on by the king. Some would even sometimes challenge the king to gain further power. Of course, at the top sat the king himself, but there isn't really much to say about him. He just kind of did what most kings do. Ruled. Unlike the rest of Europe, where social status depended on ancestry, who your parents were and their parents and their parents, in Anglo-Saxon society there was room to move up and down the social ladder. A successful peasant, for instance, or a merchant who made many successful trips in their ship and fitted all the criteria, could become a Thegn. Slaves could be freed by their masters, and ceorls could sell themselves into slavery as a desperate measure. Successful Thegns could become earls, earls kings, and bad earls could be demoted to Thegns. So there we have it, Anglo-Saxon society.